Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Sara Taylor, a cultural competence visionary, nationally recognized speaker and best-selling author, and the founder of Deep Sea Consulting. Welcome to the show, Sara.
Thanks so much for having me, AJ. Glad to be here.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form, Sara. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We will be talking about how one can navigate workplace polarization with cultural understanding, cultural intelligence, cultural competence. In this backdrop, we'll have a discussion. But before that, Sara, let's understand a bit more about you for the audience, about your background, about your journey, so that people know who they are listening to.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, I actually started working in the area of bias and stereotypes as young as junior high, believe it or not. I was giving speeches and presentations that young. In my career, I have worked as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner for 35 years. Everything from a diversity specialist, a chief diversity officer, and then 22 years ago, I started my company, Deep Sea Consulting. And in that time, in those 35 years, I've really developed an expertise, as you said, in particularly cultural competence and understanding how our brains take in and respond to differences. So again, so glad to be able to be here with you today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you for the show. Sara, now let's understand things a bit from the basic. When you say workplace polarization, should we understand it's about political polarization, or it can be any other kind of polarization? Help us understand what is workplace polarization. Are there various types of polarization?
Right, exactly. Well, all of those, workplace polarization, political polarization, all fall in the big bucket of the actual stage of development, which is polarization. So what we know, what we learned from the field of cultural competence is that polarization isn't just a fleeting. I had a bad moment, or flip a switch and I'm polarized or I'm not. It's actually the second of 5 stages of development. So think about other ways that we develop, from infant to toddler to preschooler and so on. Or think of other skills that we develop. Think first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade math. It's the same thing with cultural competence. Cultural competence, though, the skill that we're developing is a skill to help us see a full complexity of differences and respond to be our most effective self. So polarization, if you think about 5 stages, polarization is just the second. So a very, very ineffective stage. And the fact that we have so much activity there now is really discouraging when we think about that as an ineffective stage of development.
Right. So you make it sound, or am I understanding it differently? Is polarization a good word or a bad word? If people talk about in a very different sort of, understanding. So help us understand. And you talk about it's in the second stage of development. So help us understand a bit more clearly.
Yeah, polarization is actually a judgmental stage. So it's when we see differences as good, bad, us, them. Think about it like a balance scale. I got us on one side, them on the other, and one of those groups is good, the other is bad. So it isn't effective. It's more effective than the first stage, where we're oblivious to even easy to see differences, but it isn't effective. And that's what I keep trying to impress on individuals that are getting stuck there, is that they themselves are not being their most effective. They themselves are missing out on a complexity of differences. So think about those. I'll just walk through real quick those 5 stages. The first, we're oblivious to differences. The second, polarization, we're judgmental of differences. The third, we minimize the differences and pretend that they're not there. And then the last two are where we're able to be effective. And the reason why is because in the fourth stage, we're able to see the full complexity of differences that are at play, including the differences that are coming from our unconscious filters. And we could talk more about that as well. So that's the fourth stage. I see this greater complexity of differences. And then in the fifth stage, I'm able to respond to that greater complexity and be more effective and not be controlled and be a puppet to my unconscious, which is what's happening in those first three stages.
Right, right. So, for the organization, for the HR, for the leaders, how do they get into this whole thing that can happen in any organization? One is that awareness about political system, political happening, that is part of their democratic right. People may
Yes.
talk, and it is very
Yes.
common that people will have difference of opinion. How
Absolutely.
do we know whether this is difference of opinion or is a polarized sort of an opinion? And who handles this? Whose job is it to get into or not get into? When does one get into? When does it become civil, uncivil? I want to understand.
Oh my
How do you
goodness, those are
calibrate it?
all
Can be so difficult.
such great questions. Well, differences of opinion is what we actually want. We want differences. We want different ways of seeing things, different ways of approaching the challenges that we have in our organizations, and different ways of seeing the decisions we need to make. Polarization, though, is when we're not seeing the full complexity and we're judgmental. So think about the differences between that second and that fourth stage in particular. And the way I talk about it is with a visual. In the fourth stage, we're seeing incredible complexity like a pointillism painting. We're seeing every single dot of a gajillion dots on a painting. And every one of those dots, it's not good, it's not bad, it's a dot that makes up the full painting, right? Versus in the second stage of polarization, we're only seeing four dots. So we don't even know what the painting is. And we're judging those dots. So very, very simplistic and judgmental. So in the workplace, when that comes into play, what we're looking for the difference there is, are folks being judgmental? Are they being judgmental of others? Are they doing broad brush strokes for a whole group or for a whole situation or issue? Those are indicators that it's polarization versus that complexity of the fourth stage.
Right, right. Now, if an employee or group of employees, several employees, they say that we belong to a party, we are members of that party, but we are working here. And what you term as polarization is not polarization, but actually, talking about my political views. And can someone stop it? Can the HR stop it? Can the CEO stop it? Help us understand.
Yes. To move out of polarization, this is what we do to develop in general, and it's what we can do in individual situations. We focus on commonality. What do we all want? Or statements like, we all want what's best for our organization. We all want what's best for our country. And finding ways to bridge those differences in order to discuss them. Now, the thing that I really want to point out is where many leaders in HR departments fall short. It is the misperception that what we need to do is give more information. So I have someone who's polarized and saying, this group is bad. Well, the natural reaction is to come back with all kinds of data on the other side that says, no, this group isn't bad, this ... What we know is when it is a stage of development, giving more information actually counterintuitively has the opposite effect. it puts us in a position where we want to defend even more our positions, and we want to really really get into our own position and double down in our own position versus take in new information. So better strategies for folks. Think about the I think it's 5-word phrase. Can you consider the possibility? Can you consider the possibility that what you said might have been offensive to me, might have been offensive to others? Can you consider the possibility that a statement like that doesn't work to bridge divides? So, using that as a strategy encourages the other person to open more versus double down in their own views and perspectives and argue their own views and perspectives.
Right, right. So, in terms of civil behavior or incivil behavior, how do we know that this is crossing the borderline and that it is, we can term it incivil? Because you also talk about that for civility also there are misconceptions. So we
Yes.
need to relook at our civics book and understand all these things in the
Yes.
modern area times.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and one of the misconceptions is that civility is just a switch we can turn on and off. So I'm civil or I'm not, or they're civil or they're not. But actually, civility is, am I matching the group norms of this particular group? And in many ways, we have folks, again, going back to polarization, that are choosing to not do that. They are choosing to be divisive. They are choosing to make broad brushstroke statements about groups of people. That's what feels like we've got incivility going on because it doesn't match our group norms. And so, once again, the strategy is to develop, it's to better understand how my unconscious is driving my perceptions and my preferences and my perceptions about others.
Right, right, Sarah. Now let's talk about, that polarization can be just polarization. People express their views. Some people
Yeah.
express it very strongly and they have their own agenda. Till then, it is understood that still it is political. What about that cancel culture mixes with this sort of a polarization
Yes.
within the organization?
Yes, yes, yes. I call that performative polarization. So I try to show that I am, as an example, less racist by showing that, by being able to point out that someone else is racist. Or I try to show that I'm not sexist by pointing out that someone else is. And so it still gets into this. It's like these gotcha moments. The more I can catch someone else and the more I can call out other folks, then the better I appear. And all that does is, again, gets us mired into this second stage of development, which isn't helpful for any of us. In many ways, I use the analogy. Again, if we think about first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade math, that performative polarization is still coming from that second stage. So it's like we've got a room full of folks that need to solve a fifth grade problem, but we've got really, really loud second graders in the room, and they're shouting out the wrong answer. And they're criticizing other folks for not seeing what they see as the answer. That is not helpful. All that does is gets us in a spiral in the second stage of development. And why do that? Why be there?
Right, right, Sarah. So how does then we employ this thing called cultural intelligence, cultural competence, cultural, vision that you talk about? How does, and what
Yeah.
is that cultural intelligence?
Yeah, well, cultural intelligence is, some folks use that synonymously with cultural competence. I would call cultural intelligence that fourth stage of development because it's a greater awareness. It's not necessarily operating differently, adapting, which is that fifth stage. But overall, the other thing that's really important to understand is that in an average population, the majority of individuals are in those first three ineffective stages. Almost 85% of individuals are in those first three ineffective stages, have only developed to the third stage in particular. And so the work in organizations is to develop individuals so that we have more individuals operating in those effective stages, the fourth and fifth. The more individuals we develop, then the more we can develop the organization as a whole, and the more individuals can see greater equity and can work to achieve greater equity. So it's really about, imagine a bell curve of the individuals in an organization marking the stage of development that they're in. Usually the peak at that apex of the bell curve falls in the third stage. And so what we do is use very specific developmental processes, which I outline in my books, to move that apex to the more effective stages where then we're not puppets to our unconscious and we're able to be more effective ourselves as we're interacting across difference.
Right, right, Sarah. We'll come to the book also, thinking at the speed of bias. Will come. But what happens in case leaders are polarized and it is 50-50? How does that work?
Yeah, the real important piece there is that in all of our work, thousands of groups and organizations that we've worked with at Deep Sea, we've never ever seen an organization that is more developed than its leaders. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that our leaders are somehow smarter or better. What it means is that our leaders set the bar and create the culture. And so, if our leaders are operating from polarization, that pulls their organization or their community or their country back to responding from polarization. And it's a natural reaction to, if I've got a leader that is saying, your group is bad, well, my natural reaction is to want to fight. No, your group is bad. And the other thing I really want folks to see and become more aware of, that we know that stage of polarization is the one and only stage of these five that can be attached to an emotion. And that emotion is fear. So when we have leaders that are dialing up fear, and in research for my book, I saw that that's happening across the globe. We have political leaders across the globe that are using fear to create more polarization, more division. And in many ways, again, go back to, we've got fifth grade problems to solve. We don't want leaders that are operating from the second grade and getting all the rest of us mired in that stage of development as well.
Right, right, Sarah. And so let's come to your book, Thinking at the Speed of Bias. It's a nice name. How did this bias part come in instead of polarization here? Help us understand. And who is this book? But is it for leaders? Is it for general people? Or is it
Yeah.
for political leaders? Or is it for, for everyone?
Well, it really is for anyone that wants to be their most effective and wants to reduce the bias that's coming from their unconscious. What we hear a lot when we're using the book in workplace is folks will say, oh my gosh, our political leaders need this. So I guess in some ways it is for political leaders as well. But essentially what it's about is that our unconscious filters, depending on our stage of development, we are able to see or not how our unconscious filters are laden with bias, and they create our thoughts, which in turn create our actions. And so thinking at the speed of bias is a book that provides tools for anyone to utilize to catch that bias and to catch ourselves before that bias is a part of our thoughts or decisions or actions.
Right. Which has a greater speed? Is it speed of light or speed of bias? Sarah, what is faster
you
than,
know,
in your opinion?
I don't know that that's been measured, but bias is incredibly fast because our thoughts come from our unconscious, and they're laden with bias, whether we know it or not. And so, what we need to do, we can't be as fast as bias. But what we need to actually do counterintuitively is slow down our thinking process in order to catch the bias that's seeping into our decisions and actions.
Right, Sarah. And you talk about 3 steps organizational leaders can take to ensure civility, reduce tension, and foster teamwork among employees. If you can tell about
Yeah.
those 3 steps.
Yeah, it is developmental steps that I need to start with myself. I need to see my own unconscious filters and start utilizing this practice to catch my filters and weed out the bias that's coming through them. So I see myself and my own filters first. That's number one. Then I see the filters of others. How is it that I can understand their perspective through their behaviors? And then, and only then, what is my approach? How do I adapt my behavior to be most effective? And so it's not until I get to that last step that I'm actually able to be the most civil, because that's when I'm able to match my behavior to the group norms, that I'm able to weed out bias to be my most effective.
Wonderful. There is much to learn from you, understand from you, Sarah.
Thank
And
you.
I'm sure a lot of people would like to learn more from you about this, more from your book, Take Your Coaching. What is the best way for them to connect with you, Sarah?
Yeah, they could connect with me on LinkedIn, Sara Taylor on LinkedIn, or they can connect with my company, Deep Sea, and that's SEE, Deep Sea Consulting, and we can connect there as well.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thanks so much, AJ.